As a reminder for all of you, I know you're all very familiar with this. I'm Wesley Holmes with the Southeast Energy Efficiency Alliance. We are conducting this series as part of our committed efforts to expand access to energy efficiency financing resources throughout the Southeast. We're very happy to have gotten to be a part of working with lots of great partners around the region to expand finance offerings through a variety of different lenders and outlets throughout the states we serve. And we're especially proud to see the increasing interest and kind of snowballing effect of interest in on-bill financing programs offered through electric cooperatives around the Southeast. So today we're going to talk about one of the key barriers, or at least key issues folks have to deal with in pursuing those programs, which is how they source their capital. So there's actually a variety of sources that people can actually leverage, and we've seen all of them deployed throughout the region, throughout the over 20 different on-bill financing programs offered throughout the Southeast. There have been applications of initial capital to provide the upfront financing has come from a wide variety of sources, including CDFIs, federal agencies, cooperative banks, even some have opted to self-finance from their internal operating funds. We're very pleased to be joined again today by Dr. Holmes Hummel with Clean Energy Works, who has been one of the most prolific consultants working all over the country and particularly across the Southeast to help get these programs designed and started up. She's going to take us through today kind of the variety of choices that utilities have in front of them and what kind of pros and cons of the different approaches and how they navigate those. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn controls over to Holmes, and she will take us through the rest of the slides, and I will talk to you all in a moment. Take it away, Holmes.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to join Wesley in welcoming you because I can see the attendees list as each one of you check in this afternoon. I recognize a number of returning participants, and this is, of course, the 7th in a series, all of which built to this point. So before going further, I want to point out that only those who have already addressed the composition of an inclusive financing program that are covered in the prior sessions will need to solve some of the questions that are raised and answered in today's session. And if you haven't taken advantage of the recordings that SEIA has archived, I want to encourage that because we'll be drawing on some of that material, including our most recent session, which was last month on reserve funds. Let me proceed by excuse me, giving you an overview of our session today, which will include the 3 sections you see on your screen. First of all, getting ourselves oriented and precisely framing the nature of the question that utilities face when they undertake an inclusive financing program. And then once oriented to that frame, helping take on the vantage point of utility executives who are trying to distinguish between their best options for sourcing capital that would be invested in their service areas. We'll take up within that section the special case of electric cooperatives, which I think is important to distinguish for this audience. But we'll also close by looking at the broader and larger landscape of for-profit utilities that may be interested in using Wall Street capital. So first, we're going to look at the difference between sourcing and deploying capital using an example. This case is one that will be familiar to those of you who participated in the series from the start. Roanoke Electric in Eastern North Carolina was one of the first in the country to actually pull together a program that used the pay-as-you-save system to deploy capital and then to source the capital for that investment program from the United States Department of Agriculture's Rural Development Administration. This was really a landmark achievement. It represented a benchmark against which other utilities then later were starting to compare their own potential for performance, where they were able to see that Roanoke, within 90 days of deciding to pursue an inclusive financing program, was able to get authorization for millions of dollars to be drawn into their service area, one of the largest infrastructure investment campaigns that 7-county region had really seen in a generation at least. We'll talk more about the way that the Energy Efficiency Conservation Loan Program on the left side links up to their pay-as-you-save system, which is the inclusive financing program that deploys that capital. But in this slide, I want to make sure that everybody on the phone is clear that today we are focusing on sourcing capital, where the Energy Efficiency Conservation Loan Program is just one of many options. But that all of the options we're going to look at on the wholesale side of drawing capital into the local economy. The wholesale side, meaning how the utility is sourcing capital so that it can then deploy it to the retail customers that it serves. This is important because many stakeholders that I speak with often I find them confusing. Oh, our utility wants to be able to source capital, but they haven't yet done the homework to build a business case for how they want to deploy it. Well, the first thing that many capital providers want to know is, how are you planning to deploy our capital so that we'll have some confidence that you'll be able to pay us back? So oftentimes the cart before the horse is talking about sourcing capital before the utility really understands how to deploy it. That's why the sourcing capital session is coming so far down the path in the series that the Southeast Energy Efficiency Alliance is offering its stakeholders. Once the utilities and its stakeholders understand how to deploy it, sourcing capital becomes much easier. Let's look at a familiar diagram for this series, the capital cycle for inclusive financing, so that you can see where sourcing capital comes in. First, we're going to take the perspective of the utility. The utility is sourcing low-cost capital. That's the focus and the frame of today's session, so that it can deploy it with a competitive field of solution providers that are offering cost-effective solutions to customers that choose those solutions and opt into a tariff that allows the utility to associate those investments with the meter that it serves, and then allows the utility to recover its costs through a charge on the bill less than the savings that assures the utility's ability to repay the capital provider from which it is sourcing the capital. We can revisit this diagram if that cycle is unclear to anyone that's joined us today, but I want to contrast the perspective of the utility, if you take the perspective of a blue hexagon here, with the next slide, where that will shift our perspective slightly to the green hexagon. So in this slide, we're taking the perspective of the utility that's sourcing capital, deploying it, recovering that capital, and repaying the capital provider. In the next slide, you'll see the vantage point of the capital provider, which finds its way into the system as a source of capital that's deploying that capital to the utility and earning capital that the utility pays as the cost of accessing the cash to begin with. This means that the utility is essentially borrowing money at X% and using its business model to deploy and recover that capital so that it can pay the capital provider, which provides that capital provider earnings. This is not a charity program. This is a real business. It's a real business for the utility, and it's a real business for the capital provider. The capital provider expects a reward for the risk that it's taking to endow the utility with this capital and allowing the utility to put that capital to work, earning returns that then the utility repays the capital that's part of the capital provider's business model. Now, in the last session, we talked about reserve funds. And that's important because the utility may say, well, gee, if I actually take out a loan from a capital provider, which is how we normally access capital, how will I know if I deploy $10 million that I'm going to get $10 million back? we're going to talk about that in a moment. What's the risk that the utility faces when they deploy capital? Will they get 100% of it back? And what happens if they don't? The answer is the utility is still responsible for meeting its obligations to the capital provider, no matter what its performance may be on recovering its costs. That is really important to making sure that the utility is taking seriously its obligations to manage the investment portfolio and not taking for granted that it might be some sort of charity program so they can be sloppy and maybe they get the money back, maybe they don't. That's not a good place for any part of the business. The utilities have to be willing to take seriously that investments on the customer side of the meter are being made with the same demanding quality assurance and financial performance metrics that they would apply to something that they would do on the supply side. However, it's also been observed that the utility may possibly not get all of its money back. It may, in fact, have to charge off or write down some of the investments that it makes if it believes that the billed charges to a particular investment have gone bad and they won't be able to recover them. We're going to look at the field performance, which overall from the utilities that have inclusive financing programs have reported charge-off rates that are less than 0.1%. But that's where the reserve funds come in to make up that 0.1% difference. And this diagram helps you see how the utility can then be assured that they will be able to meet their obligations to the capital provider. These diagrams will be ones that we return to during the questions and answers. And in this part of the series, we're aiming to finish the opening remarks within half an hour, so we have a full half hour to return. Please be active and aggressive with your questions because your assertiveness makes sure that we're meeting your interests. With that, we're going to move on to the perspective of a utility distinguishing among its options. So the first part is to look at what utilities have already done. Here you see 6 different programs in 6 different states. They're all using the pay-as-you-save system more or less. The program in Hawaii did not use the pay-as-you-save system, but the others of them did more or less use the pay-as-you-save system. And you'll see on the right-hand side that they use different sources of capital in each case. The Eversource program used ratepayer programs, as did HECO in Hawaii. In Kansas, they used a mixture of their mainline corporate finance and state grants. In Kentucky, the source of capital came from a community development financial institution, or MACED, which has been one of the featured speakers in the series. But MACED itself originated that capital from an impact investor, which turned out to be a philanthropist, a large foundation that was interested in this area as an impact investment. You start to see as the field matures, these programs, by the way, are presented in chronological order, so you see some of the benefits of learning. And the dependence on grants or philanthropic or CDFI sources is relaxed mightily as there's more field data that helps utilities gain more confidence in what their risk exposure may be in these portfolios. And now you start to see at Roanoke Electric the first programs that are completely unsubsidized, and Ouachita Electric the same, even using a higher price source of capital that's not using the federal finance facilities available from the Rural Utility Service. Now, these capital providers do have, not only are they different sources, they have different characteristics. So now you see the same sources of capital according to their cost, who can access them, and whether or not they're recurrent. These are important characteristics because if you're a capital provider, you may at first glance really prefer a subsidized source of capital. But then you find out that if you design your program in a way that depends on subsidies, as soon as the subsidies run out, your program hits a speed bump. And so do your local contractors. And then so do their workforce. And then maybe their workforce runs out of work. And then maybe your customers start to wonder whether or not you're able to deliver. So on the first glance, the subsidized program was a way to help the utility fast track or fast start their program with extra returns or lower risk. But in the end, it could actually end up threatening the program's solvency or the ability for the utility to continue to operate, and that is actually a greater risk. You'll see that those trade-offs are serious for utilities that are thinking about scaling up, because right when they scale up, they run out of their subsidized source of capital, and they face the highest risk of being able to sustain the investment portfolio that they've led their contractors and local partners to believe they'll be able to maintain. This is a serious trade-off that has led people to evaluate whether or not it's worthwhile to pursue subsidized sources of financing or build their investment programs from the very beginning to be subsidy-free. I'm happy to return to this chart and answer more questions about these case studies, but I want to show you the third chart that also shows you the relative level of risk exposure in each of these cases, where regardless of the source of capital, no matter who the utility was or where they were sourcing their capital, once they deployed it, they were experiencing charge-off rates that were remarkably low, lower than the mainline business that these utilities were already managing. They were running multi-million-dollar programs. Every single utility on the sheet has run a multi-million-dollar program and reported that that program has outperformed their mainline business. The reason why Roanoke and Ouachita are not reporting yet is that they have had less than a year's worth of cost recovery, and it's too early for them to report a full year's worth of cost recovery data. But these figures on the right actually show why reserve funds in the long run are not necessary to offer an inclusive financing program. They really provide beginner's assurance. For utilities that lack experience with inclusive financing or the investment portfolios that they can develop on the customer side of the meter, those utility executives might wonder whether or not they will be able to manage their investment portfolios in order to meet the obligations that the utilities do have to the capital providers. Reserve funds address this barrier, the barrier of lack of confidence among the utility executives. But if it's necessary, it's a very low-cost barrier to overcome. And that's why state energy offices have been willing to risk social capital or state funds to say, if you don't have the experience that would inspire in you the confidence that you'll be able to meet your capital provider's requirements, we stand behind you because of the field data that shows us that you're at least as good as the utility managers in Kansas and these other places, that you too will have a risk that we will be able to help you manage. Now, if you are a utility provider that's choosing among sources, here are some of the attributes that you may want to consider. You want to look at sources of capital that don't cause you a large runaround or a large amount of red tape or eligibility requirements that you can't meet. And there's some important cases where at first glance the Rural Utility Service looked like it might be an excellent source of capital, but for an entity that had never used that facility before and wasn't really sure if they were even going to be eligible, it turns out that just meeting the eligibility requirements took them more than a year and a half, and in the end, they still weren't able to qualify. So that turned out to not be a very good source of capital for them. You also want to be looking at whether or not your source of capital is reliably recurring, or what's going to happen to you when the last dime runs out. Does that end up creating a cardiac arrest in a business plan that's actually hitting its pace and its stride right at that time? Of course, you want to have competitive or low-cost capital, but sometimes you might actually be willing to pay more for the capital if it has better attributes in these other areas, like no carrying costs. You see, there are some famous cases of utilities or financing programs that have gone to the capital markets and raised hundreds of millions of dollars in debt, but then not been able to deploy it quickly or quickly enough to avoid the fact that they are going to owe debt to their capital providers right away. And so suddenly they're faced with a cash call. They need to come up with debt payments to their capital provider before they've even put their capital to work, before they can even earn money with the money they've got. That's why reimbursable loans, like the ones that are accustomed to being sourced from the Rural Utility Service, are really attractive, because you don't owe anything until you deploy the money, and that means the money's been put to work in a way that you know you can recover it. No carrying costs actually may turn out to be a lower cost source of capital for you. And finally, because of the limited amount of attention and capacity within the financing division of any utility company or a third-party entity that's helping line up the capital, there's always staff constraints and capacity constraints. Anything that you can do to align the source of capital with the source of capital that's already being used diminishes the additional transaction costs that may be experienced, and also leverages the existing program processes and procedures that are in place. These are really good questions to be asking when evaluating any source of capital. Ultimately, the best sources are the mainline sources that the utility already uses for other corporate investments. So we're going to look at electric cooperatives as a special case because the Southeast Energy Efficiency Alliance serves a multi-state area where electric cooperatives have actually moved beyond where investor-owned utilities are. And they've been able to develop a field of experience that is also cultivating a rich field of learning and mutual aid and support between electric cooperatives in multiple states. 2/3 of all the electric cooperatives in the United States use as their primary source of capital the Rural Development Administration's Rural Utility Service. It's a financing facility inside the Department of Agriculture that has been one of the most successful, unsubsidized federal financing programs in American history. It has currently more than $40 billion in its portfolio, with more than $5 billion authorized every year in unsubsidized Treasury rate financing. It's been reliably available for decades, and that's why the rural utility electric cooperatives return to it year after year. The Rural Utility Service has 3 different programs that we're going to look at right now, because these are the kinds of options that electric cooperatives may be considering when they look at their mainline source of capital. First is the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Loan Program. And I say first because the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Loan Program is directly drawing off the same pool of unsubsidized, automatically reauthorized Treasury rate financing that has been available year after year after year, literally since the 1930s. So what's new is that the Energy Efficiency Conservation Loan Program, authorized in 2014, gave the electric cooperatives the ability for the very first time to use that capital for investments on the customer side of the meter. And it doesn't include any of the trappings that you will see in the following 2 programs related to competition and deadlines. And that gives it these attributes where the financing is reliably available, and it's also available on favorable terms, meaning low cost and with no carrying costs. Prior to the advent of the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Loan Program, there were already on-bill financing programs in electric cooperatives that were using rural utility service money, but the type of money they were using was coming from the Rural Electric Development Loan and Grant Program, which is affectionately called REDLEG. REDLEG is a 0% facility, so it has subsidized financing. As a result, it depends on congressional subsidies that are appropriated annually. Because of that, the annual appropriations limit the amount of money that's available. Because there's a limit, the Rural Utilities Service has to actually run a competition so that they know they are allocating the capital to a broad geographic array of purposes, many different types of projects, not just in the energy sector. Some of it goes to healthcare, some of it goes to education, some of it goes to fire trucks. And they have to cap the amount that they can give to any one place so that they can make sure that they can spread the money around. As a result, programs that depend on this type of financing will be lucky if they get $1 million, and they'll be lucky if they get it once every 5 years. This actually limits the amount that they can deploy to say, I'm going to say $200,000 a year, which might mean that they can only serve 40 households in their service area for that year. And that ultimately doesn't support and sustain the kind of economic growth that inclusive financing can foster. And that's why it may be a starting wheels place to be, but ultimately, depending on subsidized financing, can choke out the growth potential for the program. Recently, some people may have known that the Department of Agriculture has promoted a rural energy savings program that is not nearly as size constrained as the Rural Electric Development Loan and Grant Program, because it's only about energy. It doesn't have to compete with healthcare, education, fire trucks, and everything else. It's just focused on energy efficiency too, but it's still limited by congressional appropriations. Even so, there's been plenty of money there to meet the demands of those that would want to compete for the money that's available in the tournaments that are run by the Rural Utilities Service. However, those that are interested in tariff on-bill financing are essentially disqualified by the program requirements written into the statute that the Congress used to authorize the program's appropriations. As a result, inclusive financing can't use rural energy savings program funds, even when they are reauthorized by Congress. Debt-based programs are eligible, and as we've seen, there have been several electric cooperatives that have started with debt-based programs and then found that they were ultimately able to reach more of their members when they switched to more inclusive terms. Now, outside of the Rural Utility Service and the USDA, there are another third of the electric cooperatives in the country that use non-USDA financing as their primary source of capital. And when you look at the portfolio among those third, mostly they are relying on two different nonprofit nonprofit banks, that's CFC, which is a cooperative bank, and CoBank, another cooperative bank. But it's not so that the utilities in the electric cooperative part of the electric power sector are only using nonprofit cooperatively owned banks. Some of them do turn to Wall Street, and some of them use Wall Street for short-term financing in any case. So even though there's not yet been a single instance where an electric cooperative found that Wall Street capital was better than what they could get from Treasury rate, which is the lowest cost of unsubsidized financing anywhere in the American economy, Wall Street financing is still available. And some cooperatives do turn to Wall Street partners in some of their investment programs. Let's close here. We're right, I think, on time at the half hour with just one slide dedicated to third-party private sector capital. Remembering that third-party private sector capital, the likes of which might be sourced from Wall Street, hasn't been competitive with any of the other options that utilities in the Southeast have yet considered for those that have moved forward with inclusive financing thus far. But when and if the utilities in the Southeast may approach that opportunity, it's important to look first at the way they source capital already. So a utility that is looking to use third-party private sector capital would be a utility that's already using private sector capital, and they might be drawing that private sector capital through their balance sheet as a daily practice of sourcing capital for the balance sheet of the utility overall. That means there's a vice president of finance somewhere in the utility, and they run an operation that makes sure that the utility has an appropriate balance of equity and debt to run the utility responsibly. And they do that meeting the metrics of performance that keep them in the good graces of both their board and their creditors. Overall, the sources of equity and the sources of debt that they use produce a blended cost of capital for the utility, and that blended cost of capital would be the cost of capital that the utility would have as it's deploying capital for its inclusive financing program. This is distinctly different from the approach the utility may take if it wants to actually source a dedicated stream of capital just for its energy efficiency portfolio. One reason that a utility might want to segregate the sources of capital might be that the corporation could issue a green bond, which has a lower cost of capital currently in the marketplace because of the attributes of greenness that have caused buyers to compete with one another, literally fall over each other to buy green bonds. There's so much demand for green bonds that there's some evidence that the cost of capital that is yielded through green bonds is lower than a market rate cost of capital, and that would be one reason that a corporation, like Apple has done recently, would want to issue $1 billion green bond just for its energy investments that are in the clean energy space because the cost of capital is lower. The third option is to set up a special purpose entity that might allow the utility to recognize that there is capital that is flowing from a special purpose entity with whom the utility has a relationship. And that special purpose entity is flowing capital through the utility to the marketplace where the capital is being deployed for distributed energy solutions. And the utility, as you all know, is using its business model and tariff-based terms to recover that capital and repay the special purpose entity. So the special purpose entity has a special relationship to the utility that's well-defined and allows the rest of the creditors and investors in the utility to see that special purpose entity as a confined container. And that may be something that the board of directors of the utility will want to see in order to understand how this source of capital fits in with the rest of the sources of capital that they're using to finance all of the company's business. Anybody on this call or listening to the recording in the future that wants to delve more deeply into these three options for utilities that would be working with private sector capital sources may find that the expertise accumulated by counselors like Sustainable Capital Advisors, Trenton Allen in particular, who is on the board of Clean Energy Works, would be a good source of expertise to consult. And he was a guest that we wanted to arrange for this occasion, yet his travel plans coming back from a client site prevented him from joining us for this broadcast. There's plenty of additional resources and technical assistance to be used and leveraged for those of you who encounter questions that relate to the topic. With that, I think we've come to the end of the material prepared for today. And I want to make sure that we've got and use all of the time available to meet the interests of those of you who've tuned in, knowing that some of you have already been through the prior successions and have worked out some of the problems or challenges that you might face in the states where you work in order to introduce inclusive financing or grow the potential of the portfolios that would stimulate investment in the economies where you work. Wesley, let me turn this back over to you to moderate as you see fit.
All right, thank you, Holmes. And so as we've done in the past, folks, if you just want to utilize the questions tab down in the lower right hand of the taskbar, feel free to go ahead and drop your questions in and we'll field those to Holmes. I guess it's kind of a starting point. Holmes, can you, I guess based on, looking at programs nationally or in the Southeast in particular, are any of the three kind of predominant or showing to be the most predominant options for people to use for financing, or have they started with one and decided to switch to another because they found it easier or lower cost of capital or better services, anything like that?
That is a great question. You know, Midwest Energy in Kansas has had multiple sources of capital over the course of 8 years, and nearly, I think there must be approaching $10 million in capital deployment at this point. So they started out with, I think it was a state grant. Then they used their own working capital, which came from CFC. And then the Recovery Act happened, which made it possible for them to access capital at lower cost than even CFC. And so, well, what's the harm of that? So they switched back to a government source of capital, which essentially serves them a little bit like seed money for a revolving loan fund. So they didn't have to pay a cost of capital to draw that in as additional sources. Right now, I'm not really sure if they've totally committed all of those funds and gone back to CFC. So it's a good question to ask them, but it's a good example of the way that those utility executives were easily able to see the virtues of tapping their lowest cost of capital at any given time while making sure that they could continue to supply the source of capital that would be needed to pay contractors that were making cost-effective investments their consumers wanted in their service area.
So, question we're getting here. Bear with me, I'm trying to read it first. Okay, so it says nearly all uses of funding discussed seem to be targeted to the customer copay or consumer loan side of the equation. Are you aware of any funding sources that can be used to supplement the utility rebate side of the total energy efficiency investment side of the equation? Holmes, are you on mute, or did you understand the context?
Wesley, I'm so sorry. I was on mute, so when I turned it over to you, I'm sorry. I was talking, right? I said I wanted to unpack this question for a moment because I want to be clear and make sure others aren't misunderstanding. No part of the content in the last half hour has addressed customer co-payments or where customers may go to get capital themselves. We haven't discussed consumer access to capital for co-payments, whether it's cash or credit. Though we do know that utilities in multiple states have reported that there have been plenty of customers that have seen that the investments in their location almost pencil out, but not quite, and therefore they do need a co-payment, and that actually many customers have been willing to pay co-payments of up to $1,000 because the utility is coming in with 5 times as much investment. The context of sourcing capital for the consumer isn't a part of today's session. I'm happy to delve into it. Anybody who wants to follow up with us during office hours tomorrow, we can pick it up. But I do still take as a good point the fact that utilities often manage supplemental sources of capital, such as ratepayer-funded rebate programs that help buy down the cost of the investment before the utility finances the remaining costs. That is a really good juxtaposition for us to highlight here, because the ratepayer-funded rebate programs are scarcely resourced. They are always at their limits. It's really precious money. And I would say overall, it can be well observed that in the Southeast, electric cooperatives, since that's been a point of focus on this call, have underinvested in energy efficiency. And under-resource their energy efficiency portfolios because they don't necessarily have the same ratepayer-funded programming that is required of investor-owned utilities by commissions in multiple states. That said, the rebate programs can be better resourced through policies that set up energy efficiency resource standards. North Carolina, I think, is still the only southern state that has an energy efficiency resource standard. And it has definitely been true that the electric cooperatives in that state, as well as Duke, the primary utility, has spent more on energy efficiency as a result of that policy. So that's one good way to increase the amount of capital that's available. But that capital is not investment capital. And this whole program today is on sourcing capital for inclusive financing portfolios. It's not recommended to use ratepayer funds as the source of capital, even though the earliest programs did do that. I'm talking like a decade ago. New Hampshire, Hawaii, Kansas. At first, they were using ratepayer funds. Well, excuse me, New Hampshire and Hawaii. And it's not recommended. It's recommended that we increase the amount of ratepayer funds that are used for incentive programs, but not to use them as sources of capital for financing. I know I dwelled on that question probably longer than you wanted, Wesley, but it was important to make sure that we didn't misunderstand concepts between consumer co-payments, the sources of funding for rebates, and whether or not those sources of funding for rebates should also be used for inclusive financing capital, which is not recommended. I hope that's helpful.
No, it was very helpful, Holmes, and thanks for the clarification. And just as part of the follow-up to that question, I want to know if we could follow up, and they could follow up with you directly. And as you mentioned, we will make contact information available. We highly recommend folks take advantage of the office hours that are scheduled for tomorrow, which will be running from 1 to 2, and we'll be sending out an email reminder of that with the call information for that call tomorrow. Another question we have here, are special purpose entities created or managed by the utilities, by utility program operators, or other third parties?
That's an excellent question. Special purpose entities can be arranged by third parties to the utility, but the utility needs to have a dedicated and well-described relationship to them. Well, friends, that's the special purpose. Special purpose entities are common in the financial sector, and they are actually common in the energy sector. And we've seen it more often outside of the southeastern states. We've seen it in places, in particular, a rising degree of interest in places that have green banks, which are themselves staffed with people who are well equipped to construct special purpose entities for clean energy investments in particular. So special purpose entities can be set up by the capital provider, a third party that is arranging the capital, or a program operator even that's bringing a turnkey solution. For example, in the case of the House Smart Kentucky program, the Mountain Association for Community Economic Development is a financial institution that's both a capital provider and a program operator. And so MACED, which is the acronym for that CDFI, MACED has essentially brought a source of capital that is not dedicated in a special purpose entity, but it's a dedicated bucket of money that they manage at the financial institution for the purpose of financing the investments that the utilities have, and the utilities use that source of capital only for that purpose. In that case, there's not an actual corporate entity called a special purpose entity to make that program run, but the whole thing could very well be bundled up in a bow and dedicated to a special purpose entity. It would be a good model for it. Again, office hours is a good time to delve into that further for those who are interested.
Another question we have here, what is the most common source of capital for investor-owned utilities?
The precedent for that would be with for-profit utilities in New Hampshire and in Hawaii. In both cases, they have used ratepayer funds. In both cases, those utilities are chronically constrained by the scale of their ratepayer funds to grow their portfolios. That's one of the reasons it's not recommended. The question that would follow directly after that is, well, if the investor in utility was to use the same source of capital that it uses for its mainline business, wouldn't that mean that it would be entitled to a similar return on investment that its mainline sources of capital are able to earn when they invest in other parts of their energy infrastructure? This question does not have a precedent answer in the field. My personal view on it is that that's the future. That is the future of a utility that wants to see the 21st century objectives of sustainability, energy security, and energy sufficiency of reliable, affordable power met with the increasingly competitive consumer-side solutions that make up the whole body of distributed energy resources. In other words, a utility that stands on the sidelines and refuses to figure out how its future relates to the suite of technologies on the distributed side of the customer's meter is a utility that's not fit to be competitive in 21st century energy sector where consumers are choosing those solutions. As a result, if a utility is actually deploying capital and recovering it through tariff-based terms, it stands to reason that their source of capital should be able to earn a similar return on equity. And so they would end up using, in the future, the most common source of capital for an investor-owned utility would be the most common source of capital that it uses now. And that would be the sources of capital that they draw upon in order to deploy capital that meets their regulated objectives by commissions that sanction the returns on the equity that they deploy. I hope that's a helpful response. As with each of these questions, happy to delve further in office hours, if not today.
All right, great. Thank you, Holmes. I believe we've reached the end of our posted questions. So if anybody has any, please hold those until tomorrow during office hours. I would like to remind folks that we do have one more session coming up for our inclusive financing series, where we're going to be talking about inclusive financing and workforce development. As it's been noted throughout this series, that inclusive financing actually reaches a number of underserved markets throughout the region. And they're often places where local contractors and contractor networks have had the hardest trouble getting job opportunities in those communities because there's simply no capital to support the investments in those properties. And so when these programs do become available, there's often an initial struggle to find ways to how do you support the adequate growth and training of workforce to serve those previously underrepresented markets. And so we're going to be, our next session will focus on opportunities to expand workforce opportunities, to grow job opportunities, and how to build and maintain an effective workforce to support inclusive financing programs. So that session will be held on August 17th from 2 to 3 p.m. You will receive your registration links from GoToWebinar within the next week. So look forward to those. And again, if y'all have any questions or would like to delve further into your questions you offered today, we will be providing office hours tomorrow from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. So we look forward to talking to you all again then. And with that, I would like to, of course, again, thank our gracious host, Holmes Hummel, for taking the time to walk us through all these elements today. And we'll see you next time. So thank you all again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.